Growing up, my relationship with my father was one of the strongest bonds in my life. He was my hero, my confidant, and my role model. We spent countless hours together talking about everything from the latest movies to the complexities of the universe. When he passed away, it felt like a part of me had died with him. In the wake of my father's death, my family was thrown into turmoil. My mother was devastated, and my stepsister and I both struggled to come to terms with our loss. Despite our grief, however, we tried to support each other as best we could. Over time, though, things began to change. My stepsister, who had always been somewhat jealous of the close relationship I had with my father, began to grow more distant from me. She was my mother's first husband's child. Mom had grown attached to her, and when she got divorced, her husband willingly gave her full custody. At first, I didn't think too much of it, but as the weeks turned into months, her behavior became more and more hostile. It wasn't just my stepsister who was changing, though. My ex-husband, whom I had once thought of as the love of my life, was also behaving strangely. He was distant and aloof, and I couldn't help but feel like he was hiding something from me. At first, I tried to ignore my suspicions, telling myself that I was just being paranoid. But as time went on, I began to notice more and more signs that something was wrong. He was spending more and more time with my stepsister, and I couldn't help but feel like they were plotting something behind my back. When I finally confronted him, he denied everything. He told me that I was imagining things, that he still loved me even though we were divorced, and that he would never do anything to hurt me. But deep down, I knew that something was wrong. It wasn't until after my father's inheritance was revealed that I discovered the truth. My stepsister and ex-husband had been plotting against me all along, spreading lies and rumors about me to our family members in an attempt to take the inheritance money for themselves. And they had succeeded. My mother and the rest of my family had turned against me, believing the lies that my stepsister and ex-husband had fed them. I was shocked and devastated. How could the people who were supposed to love me the most, my family members, turn on me so quickly and so easily? And how could my ex-husband, the man I had once loved and trusted with my life, be so deceitful and cruel? I tried to talk to my mother about what had happened, but she wouldn't listen. She was convinced that I was lying and that I was trying to steal the inheritance money from her. No matter what I said or did, she refused to believe me. The rest of my family was no better. They had all turned against me, believing the lies and rumors that my stepsister and ex-husband had spread about me. No matter how much I tried to explain the truth to them, they wouldn't listen. It was like I was living in some sort of nightmare. I couldn't believe that my own family could be so cruel and heartless. I felt completely alone, like no one in the world cared about me or believed in me. But even though it was difficult, I refused to give up. I kept trying to talk to my mother and the rest of the family to make them see the truth. I wrote letters, sent emails, and made phone calls. Anything to try to get through to them, but nothing worked. They were all convinced that I was lying and trying to steal my mother's inheritance money, and no matter how much I wanted to convince them otherwise, they refused to listen. In the months that followed, I did my best to hold on to what was left of my relationships with my family members. But it was a losing battle. My stepsister and ex-husband continued to spread their lies, and my mother and other family members were all too willing to believe them. I decided to confront my ex-husband and stepsister about what they had done. I arranged to meet them at a coffee shop, and as soon as I saw them, I knew that things were going to get ugly. I asked them why they had turned on me, why they had lied to my family members and turned them against me. They didn't even try to deny it. Eventually, they admitted that they had wanted the inheritance money for themselves, but with me in the picture, they wouldn't have access to it. And then, to my horror, they told me that they were dating, that they had been seeing each other ever since my father's death. They had been using me and my family as pawns in their twisted game, all so that they could be together and have access to the inheritance money. I was stunned. I couldn't believe that the two people I had once trusted with my life could be so cruel and manipulative. It was like my entire world had been turned upside down, but I had recorded this conversation. I knew my family wouldn't believe me, but I knew my father's lawyer. I sent it to him. According to my father's will, everybody had been informed that my father's inheritance would be passed on 2 years after his demise. I can't talk sense into my mother, but at least the lawyer could when the time is right. For the next 2 years, I continued with my life, trying to move on from the hurt and betrayal. I didn't talk to my family much, and when I did, it was with one cousin who still believed me. I avoided any discussions about the inheritance. I didn't want to deal with the politics anymore. As the 2 years passed, I knew that the time would come when my family would find out the truth. My father's lawyer had informed them of the terms of the will, and I knew that my ex-husband and stepsister would have to face the consequences of their actions, but I would just let the family deal with them. As the 2-year mark approached, I received a flurry of messages and missed calls from my mother and other family members. At first, I didn't know what to do. After all, they had all turned their backs on me when my stepsister and ex-husband started spreading their lies. But as the messages continued to pour in, I realized that I couldn't ignore them forever. Eventually, I decided to pick up the phone and talk to my mother. As I picked up the phone, I took a deep breath, unsure of what to expect. My mother's voice sounded hesitant as she spoke, asking me how I was doing and trying to make small talk. I knew that she wanted to talk about the inheritance, but I wasn't ready for that just yet. I listened as my mother talked about how much she missed me and how she wished that we could all be a family again. But I couldn't forget how easily she had believed the lies of my ex-husband and my stepsister. I remained polite but distant, not wanting to engage in any further drama. Eventually, my mother brought up the inheritance, but I simply told her that I didn't want to discuss it. As the conversation came to an end, my mother sounded disappointed and hurt, but I couldn't bring myself to care. After everything that had happened, I knew that it was time for me to focus on my own life and let my family deal with the consequences of their actions. As for the rest of my family, they were more aggressive in their attempts to reach me. My phone was constantly buzzing with notifications from various family members, all demanding to know why I hadn't responded to their messages. I did my best to ignore them, but it was hard not to feel overwhelmed by the sheer number of messages I was receiving. As the messages from my family continued to flood in, I received a call from my father's lawyer requesting a meeting with me and my mother. I was curious about what the meeting would be about, but I also felt a sense of dread. I knew that my family was eager to get their hands on my father's inheritance, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. During the meeting, the lawyer informed me that my father had left a legal heir, but he refused to disclose the contents of the document without me present. I was relieved to hear that the lawyer had stood his ground and refused to give in to my family's demands, but I also felt a sense of anger and frustration. It was clear that my family had been hounding me because they wanted to know what my father had left behind, and I couldn't help but feel like they were only interested in me now because of the potential inheritance. Even my mother. During the meeting with my mother and my father's lawyer, I was filled with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. The lawyer began by explaining that my father had indeed left a legal heir. However, my relief was short-lived as the lawyer then revealed the contents of the document. To my surprise, all of the inheritance had been left to me instead of my mother. I was stunned, and I could see the shock on my mother's face as well. It was a lot to take in, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of happiness for being the one to receive the inheritance. After all, they had put me through. The lawyer then played the recording that I had sent him years ago, on which my ex-husband and stepsister were discussing their plans to manipulate my mother and take control of her assets. Hearing their words again was like a punch in the gut. It brought back all of the feelings of betrayal and hurt that I had felt when I first heard the recording. As the recording ended, I looked over at my mother, and her expression was one of shock and disbelief. It was clear that she had no idea about the betrayal that had occurred. I could see the hurt and pain in her eyes. As my mother looked at me with tears streaming down her face, she suddenly burst out, "How could you not tell me? How could you keep this from me?" Her voice was filled with pain and hurt, and I could see how much this revelation was affecting her. She continued to apologize, but I found that I couldn't bring myself to care. The years of lies and deceit had taken their toll, and I had grown numb to my mother's tears. It was hard to believe that the human in front of me was the same person who had been complicit in my stepsister and ex-husband's betrayal. I remained silent, unable to find the right words to say. It was clear that my mother was struggling to come to terms with everything that had happened, but I couldn't bring myself to offer her any comfort. The pain and hurt was still too fresh in my mind, and I didn't know if I could ever fully forgive her. The meeting ended soon after that, and I left. Update 1. In the 2 weeks that followed the meeting with my mother and the lawyer, things became chaotic. News of what my stepsister and ex-husband had done started spreading like wildfire within the family. It seemed that everyone was talking about it, and some family members even reached out to me to offer their sympathies and support. Despite my attempts to avoid them, my stepsister and ex-husband continued to try and contact me. They left voicemails and sent texts, but I refused to respond to any of them. The messages were filled with apologies and pleas for forgiveness, but I wasn't ready to entertain their requests. I knew they were fake. My mother also tried to contact me multiple times, leaving messages and texts begging for forgiveness and apologizing for her role in the situation. I could sense the genuine remorse in her words, but I still couldn't bring myself to care. The betrayal and hurt was still too raw, and I wasn't sure if I could ever be able to fully forgive her. Other family members also tried to reach out, with some sending messages of support while others expressed their disappointment and anger at what had happened. The messages varied, but they all seemed to be focused on me and how I was dealing with the situation. NTA, OP's stepsister and ex are such big a-holes. They not only dated each other but also turned the whole family against her. Karma is a bitch. OP deserves the inheritance. Let them go and have their fairy tale ending in the ditch. OP doesn't have to care about them. Now that she has the inheritance, look how the whole family flocks around her. NTA, cut them off for good. Next story. I live in an apartment with my fiancé. About 5 months ago, we got new neighbors. From the beginning, they were terrible neighbors. They left trash in the hallway, played loud music past 1 a.m., and argued constantly. Most of that I was willing to ignore because we live in apartments. It's unfortunately to be expected aside from late-night music. The walls are fairly soundproof, so most of the time the noise is not the worst thing in the world. The landlords have talked to them, and they had become more reasonable. However, they have 2 small children, maybe around 5 and 6, if I had to guess, and their children scream. All day they scream and cry and fight with each other, and the parents do nothing to stop them. I understand their children, but it cannot be good for them to be screaming like that constantly. It always seemed weird to me that there is rarely a quiet moment. We've asked them several times politely to get them to stop, but they never put a lot of effort into silencing their kids. We've contacted the office and have called the cops on really bad nights, but it still doesn't let up. Well, enough was enough. My hours recently changed to mornings, and while my work schedule and getting sleep is not their concern, I should be allowed to expect to have a quiet night in the neighborhood. Around 3 a.m., 2 hours before I had to get up, their kids started yelling, which has happened before on multiple occasions. I could hear them running around, banging spoons or something on pots and pans, which is almost a daily occurrence. The mother screamed at them to shut the frick up, but they just didn't stop. So I called CPS and told them I suspected they were being mistreated, which honestly was not a lie because it was concerning the amount of screaming coming from that house. I suspect they may have had the kids taken, as for the past week, There have been no screams from the kids. I told my fiance what I did, and he thinks I shouldn't have done it. I asked some of our friends and my parents, and they all say the same thing. I should have sucked it up and minded my own business. I didn't think I did anything wrong, but I feel that if their parents cared about them, they wouldn't let them behave like that. So AITA? Edit. I want to clarify that things have been like this from the beginning. Their children have been like this since day one. It is nothing new to anybody. Edit 2. I also want to clarify that I have only seen these children once when they moved in, which in my mind has always been a red flag. I never called CPS before because I never heard them being beaten up or anything, just their mother occasionally shouting at them. So I never knew for sure. I don't know the home situation, but everything from the beginning did always seem very odd. I never hear them leave the apartment when I'm home on my off days. I have rotating off days. And I don't know what kind of jobs the parents have. I don't know a lot about CPS, if I'm honest, but I always thought they would do something if something needed to be done. NTA, CPS doesn't take kids because they're loud or even up at 3 a.m. They remove children because they are in danger or being neglected or abused. You did the right thing. I wish someone had done that for me when I was a kid. Next story. I'm still dumbfounded over this whole situation, and I don't know if I handled it correctly, but here we are. My nephew, 31, male, began dating Jessie, 28, female, close to a year ago. They had met each other's families, and the relationship was progressing smoothly. I even met her myself at a recent dinner where the situation in question took place. My nephew and Jessie show up and introductions are made. Everything was fine until I introduced myself by first name. As soon as she heard my name, Jessie asked me, "Wait, are you," first name, "nephew's last name?" I confirmed that that was my name, and she then asked me if I used to teach at elementary school the next state over, which I confirmed. It was then that I remembered Jessie as a student there. I don't know what disabilities she ended up having, but I do remember that other teachers wanted to have Jessie put in special ed, which her parents were resistant to, so they pulled her out and homeschooled her to avoid any diagnosis. She revealed the last bit to us later that night. I told her my nephew spoke highly of her professional accomplishments and that I was glad that things turned out well for her in the end. She scoffed at me and said I definitely didn't help. I was confused and asked for clarification since I don't really remember any specific incident with Jessie. She told me that I clearly don't remember writing her up for fricking nothing. I didn't, and admitted as much. She then angrily told me that she vividly remembered that I made her take a note home to her parents to have signed for talking back to her. She then ended it with, "I don't even remember what was said anymore, but I can tell you that I wasn't talking back to you. I was asking you to explain what I did wrong and why it was wrong." I apologized for the misunderstanding, but Jessie wasn't happy. She continued to make snide remarks about how the school couldn't leave well enough alone about whatever issues she was having and caused irreparable damage to her life. I tried to apologize for any upset, but she didn't want it. I don't know if I was wrong here or not. I know the school had all students' best interests at heart, and I don't remember the back-talking incident, but Jessie seems convinced of it. AITA? NTA, it sounds like you were disciplining a child who probably needed it, and the child, instead of accepting correction, wanted to explain to you why you were wrong and why you were misunderstanding her. Emotionally well-adjusted 28-year-olds don't carry grudges about getting in trouble for talking back in elementary school. That's not a particularly serious infraction. Stay tuned for more stories from our girl relationships.